Do extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence? Well, absolutely, yes, they do. In fact, all claims require at least the potential preponderance of evidence, something that far too many people tend to overlook. Just because you're emotionally attached to an idea, that doesn't make that thing true until you can back it up. And the religious fall into that trap a lot. So let's go see another example. Today, we're going to be taking a look at a TikTok response by Eric Manning over at Testify. And I'll be really honest up front, I hate TikTok because I don't think that you can have any intelligent conversations in 60-second snippets or less, any more than you can do that over on Twitter, because Twitter is absolutely stupid. These things require nuance, and you're not going to get a lot of nuance there. So I'm going to be responding to a response, and that's a little bit messy, but I think it's important to show the failures in the thought processes of the religious, again, because we do that a lot around here. What you want to be true doesn't matter. It's what you can prove is true that does. So let's get to it.
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Awesome. Let's talk about the extraordinary documentary evidence that we have for Christianity.
That would be great if you actually had any, but you don't. And this is a problem that we run into for all religious people, not just Christianity, because believers accept things on faith that simply don't stand up to any kind of critical scrutiny in the real world. They tend to take mere claims as facts because they really want to believe that the claims are true, but that's not evidence. That's an assumption. It's a belief. It's faith. And faith doesn't mean anything. You have to remember what evidence is. It is the available body of facts or information indicating whether a belief or proposition is true or valid. And that means that anything that you provide must be a fact. It must be demonstrable. It can't just be a claim that you pulled out of your ass. It can't be something that somebody stuck in a book. It has to be testable and verifiable, and the religious rarely ever have anything that remotely qualifies. So with that in mind, let's see where he goes.
It is true that there are things that we believe about history that provide as much evidence as we have for the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
Cool. We're on the same page so far.
Not really. Now, I have no idea who she is, but what she said is true as far as it goes. Some of the claims from history do provide as much evidence as claims about the resurrection of Jesus. But that doesn't mean that any of those things are good evidence. Because here's the thing. I personally don't care about history the way that you care about your theology. I am not emotionally invested in things happening the way that we think they might have happened. If it turns out tomorrow that any figure from history wasn't actually real, so what? I don't care if Socrates was real or Genghis Khan or Julius Caesar, fill in the blank. It doesn't matter to me one bit. If it turned out tomorrow that Abraham Lincoln was a mass delusion perpetuated by aliens for some nefarious scheme, yeah, okay, I'd be fine with that. I just change my paradigm and move on with my life. It really wouldn't change things for me at all. I would just accept what we have the best evidence for. Yet, for Christians, they have to believe that there was a real Jesus. Muslims have to have a real Muhammad, or their entire worldviews implode. They simply don't have that luxury, and that's their problem, not ours.
And when I bring up the fact that all we have to show for the resurrection of Jesus are some ancient texts that are not even originals and are copies made of copies, people will respond with something like this. They say, well, history's just like that. A lot of things that we believe about history are recorded in copies of ancient texts.
All right, before I let him respond, there's a very obvious edit in the middle of that. Why is that? See, the reason that I insist on responding to complete videos is because I don't want anybody accusing me of taking anything out of context. I don't edit most of the time, other than to cut out some stuff off the end, or maybe to fast forward through some stuff in the middle that's just boring. But mostly, I stick to the entire video because I want people to think, hey, I'm responding to what was actually said. I also provide links to the original source material in the description every single time. Testify doesn't. There's no link to the original video so that we can go and look at what was in those clumsy edits. Was it in the original, or did he do it himself because it was something that he couldn't respond to? These are questions that we need to be asking. And usually, they're questions that the religious don't have answers for.
Oh, so documentary evidence isn't good enough to establish a miracle. I smell the rotting corpse of David Hume.
No, sorry, they're not going to establish anything. You don't think so either. There are passages in the Quran that make claims of miracles. Do you think those happened as described? There are passages in plenty of religious texts that claim miracles. Are all of those true as described? Well, of course not. You don't think so. I don't think so. There's no evidence to actually support them. You only care about your beliefs. You don't care about consistency. If it's good enough for the Bible, it ought to be good enough for everything else. But you don't think that, do you? Because you don't get to just pick and choose.
But there are varying levels of belief and varying levels of consequences to those beliefs. I've had people say things like, how do you know George Washington existed? If we're talking about whether or not Jesus existed, I have no problem believing that Jesus was a person that existed historically. We have good reason to believe that.
And there go a lot more edits. Now, those could be in the original. That's fine. I understand that. But that's why it's important to have links to the original source material so that you can know what was actually said. Regardless, though, I do disagree here. I don't think that Jesus was a real person, depending on what you mean by Jesus. That's something that Christians never ever address, though. What Jesus do you actually mean? Some guy who might have existed 2,000 years ago, or a magical man god that did miracles and rose from the dead? The latter is clear nonsense. We have no evidence of any kind for that whatsoever outside of empty claims made in a book of mythology. The former, though, we wouldn't know anything at all about such a person because we don't have any evidence for that either. Is it possible? Sure, I guess. Why not? Possible doesn't make it true. There could have been a real guy or an assemblage of guys upon whom these myths were based. But we don't know anything at all about any of that. His existence has been so completely mythologized that we're left with less than a shadow, and you can't make real-world determinations without more information. I don't care what you want to be true. I care what you can prove is true, and you people can't prove a thing. I can't see how you can get from, well, there could have been, to there was, without any actual evidence. But let's see what Eric has to say.
So the documentary evidence is good enough to establish the existence of Jesus. Thank you at least for not being a mythicist.
Like, that's a bad thing. We have absolutely no evidence that there ever was a real Jesus, whether you like that fact or not. We've got stories in a book written by completely anonymous authors who we have no idea what they saw, if they ever saw anything. We don't have anything, and this is where I really have to take a lot of secular people to task. You can't just say, well, it's not an extraordinary claim, so we'll buy into it. No, you don't do that. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, but that doesn't mean that non-extraordinary claims require nothing. That's just stupid. The Bible is the claim. It's not the evidence for the claim. You have to do a whole lot better than that, and that goes for everybody.
But when you say that Jesus died and rose from the dead, I need more evidence than some ancient texts, especially if his rising from the dead is supposed to have implications for my life. This is where critical thinking comes in. We don't believe every single thing that was ever written down in every historical text and then dedicate our lives to it.
Okay, so again, if a group of people witnessed a miracle, whether it was 200 years ago or 2,000 years ago, how would we know about it outside of it being written in ancient text? Yeah, the stakes are a whole lot higher here than believing in George Washington, which is just a mundane claim. But writing decades before David Hume, I think Thomas Sherlock hits the nail on the head here when he writes, "Man rising from the grave is an object of sense, and can give the same evidence of his being alive as any other man in the world can give. So that a resurrection considered only as a fact to be proved by evidence is a plain case. It requires no greater ability in the witnesses than that to be able to distinguish between a man dead and a man alive, point in which I believe every living man thinks himself a judge. I do allow that in this case and others of like nature require more evidence to give them credit than ordinary cases do. You may therefore require more evidence in these than in other cases, but it is absurd to say that such cases admit no evidence when the things in question are manifestly objects of sense."
No, they're not. Because here's the thing. There are people today and throughout history that are claimed to have come back from the dead. In Egypt, Osiris and Baal. In Greek mythology, Achilles, Castor, and Heracles. They all came back from the dead. There are stories in Buddhism of masters returning to life. So why do you not accept that all of those things happened, but you buy into the Jesus myth? There's all kinds of stories out there of people in the modern day claiming resurrections. Some of those are Christian stories, some of them are not. None of them can be verified by actual medical professionals. Just because you want to believe a thing, that doesn't make that thing true. Just because somebody says a thing happened, that doesn't mean that it happened. You still need to provide better evidence than you have because you really don't have any. Granted, in the case of a potentially real Jesus, you really can't have any, but that's your problem, not mine. If God wants it to be believable, then he needs to pony up something better. Let us know when he does, because right now, it's not at all impressive.
This is where we got to examine the ancient documents and see what their relationship to truth is. Were the original eyewitnesses mistaken? Did the gospel authors come along later and fudge the details? What kinds of evidence do we have for the honest, unembellished nature of the gospels? If we, after the fact, examine the documents and find that things are explained without difficulty by supposing that a miracle happened, but not without greater implausibility that a miracle didn't happen, well, that, my friend, is evidence for a miracle. Given the high stakes, isn't that all the more reason to examine their testimony rather than reject it just because it's written down in an ancient text?
No, it's not. You are presuming that any of this stuff ever happened at all, which is your problem, not ours. This is where the emotional nature of religion gets in the way of a rational search for truth. They start off with the desire for these things to be true before they even look at the evidence, before they even look for any evidence, because most of the time they're not even doing that. They are convinced for entirely emotional reasons, not intellectual ones. And that's kind of a problem. It's why scholarship attempts to remove bias, or at the very least, to mitigate its effects. The religious, on the other hand, they embrace their biases. They're proud of their biases. It's gotta be true because they want it to be true. But that's not a good way to actually determine truth. Truth is a process. It's a methodology. It's not just an emotional conclusion. You get there by repeatedly testing our ideas to find out if they stand up to critical scrutiny in the real world. And for these claims in religion, they simply don't. They just don't. It's why the religious start off with the unjustified conclusion that their holy books are true because they really want them to be true. Why? Because that's how it's got to be. How do you test that, though? Well, you can't, and they don't even try. It's just an assumption, and we all know what they say about assumptions, don't we? What matters here is the independent evidence, and there just isn't any for the Bible. It's like the Trojan War. We didn't believe that it happened for a very, very long time, no matter what it said in the Homeric epics. Then we found evidence, actual archaeological, defensible, demonstrable evidence, and we started to accept that the war itself was probably real. But that doesn't mean that all the stories of gods and goddesses and all of that were to be believed blindly. Those are still unsupported. But the stuff that we can now prove that happened, at least based on the best evidence that we have access to at the moment. Christianity and other religions, they don't get an out just because you really want to, just because you get a warm fuzzy believing it. The things that we actually have evidence for, we accept. The things that we don't, we don't. Jesus is one of the things that we just don't have any independent, objectively verifiable evidence for. And I'm not going to accept Jesus until you can define Jesus in some kind of rationally defensible way and then provide evidence that said Jesus actually existed. That you can't, and we all know that you can't, that's pretty understandable, but it doesn't change anything. Belief needs to be apportioned to the available evidence, and you just don't have any. Not for a potentially real man who wandered Palestine 2,000 years ago, and certainly not for a magical man-god that rose from the dead. You have nothing but claims, and so long as that's the case, nobody with a brain in their head ought to believe it. Just because you really want it to be true, that doesn't make it true. You have to do a whole lot better than that, and unfortunately, Eric just can't.
Bum